The Madness of Pelagius. The man who would be emperor of all Tamriel was born Thoris Pelagius Septim, a prince of the royal family of Wayrest in the Third Era, 119, at the end of the glorious reign of his uncle, Antiochus I. Wayrest had been showered by much preference during the years before Pelagius' birth, for King Magnus was Antiochus's favorite brother. It is hard to say when Pelagius' madness first manifested itself, for in truth, the first 10 years of his life were marked by much insanity in the land itself. When Pelagius was just over a year old, Antiochus died, and a daughter, Kintyra, assumed the throne to the acclaim of all. Kintyra II was Pelagius' cousin, and an accomplished mystic and sorceress. If she had sufficient means to peer into the future, she would have surely fled the palace. The story of the War of the Red Diamond has been told in many other scholarly journals, but as most historians agree, Kintyra II's reign was usurped by her and Pelagius' cousin Uriel by the power of his mother Potema, the so-called Wolf Queen of Solitude. The year after her coronation, Kintyra was trapped in Glenpoint and imprisoned in the imperial dungeons there. All of Tamriel exploded into warfare as Prince Uriel took the throne as Uriel III in High Rock, because of the imprisoned empress's presence there was the location of some of the bloodiest battles. Pelagius' father, King Magnus, allied himself with his brother Sepphoris against the usurper emperor and brought the wrath of Uriel III and the Queen Potema down on Wayrest. Pelagius, his brothers and sisters, and his mother Uthiela fled to the Isle of Balfura. Uthiela was of the line of Durini, and her family's manse is still located on that isle even to this day. There is thankfully much written record of Pelagius' childhood in Balfura, recorded by nurses and visitors. All who met him described him as a handsome, personable boy, interested in sport, magic, and music. Even assuming diplomats' lack of candor, Pelagius seemed, if anything, a blessing to the future of the Septim dynasty. When Pelagius was 8, Sepphoris slew Uriel III at the Battle of Ichidog, and proclaimed himself emperor. Sepphoris I. Now, for the next 10 years of his reign, Sepphoris battled Potema. Pelagius' first battle was the Siege of Solitude, which ended with Potema's death and the final end of the war. In gratitude, Sepphoris placed Pelagius on the throne of Solitude. As King of Solitude, Pelagius' eccentricities of behavior began to be noticeable. As a favorite nephew of the emperor, few diplomats to Solitude made a critical commentary about Pelagius. For the first 2 years of his reign, Pelagius was at the very least noted for his alarming shifts in weight. 4 months after taking the throne, a diplomat from Ebonheart called Pelagius a hale and hearty soul with a heart so big it widens his waist. 5 months after that, the visiting princess of Firsthold wrote to her brother saying that the kings gripped my hand and it felt like it was being clutched by a skeleton. Pelagius is greatly emaciated indeed. Sepphoris never married and died childless 3 years after the Siege of Solitude. As the only surviving sibling, Pelagius' father, Magnus, left the throne of Wayrest and took residence at the imperial city as the emperor, Magnus I. Magnus was elderly and Pelagius was his oldest living child, so the attention of Tamriel focused on Sentinel. By this time, Pelagius' eccentricities were becoming infamous. There are many legends about his acts as king of Sentinel, but few well-documented cases exist. It is known that Pelagius locked the young princes and princesses of Silvanar in his room with him, only releasing them when an unsigned declaration of war was slipped under the door. When he tore off his clothes during a speech he was giving at a local festival, his advisors apparently decided to watch him more carefully. On the orders of Magnus, Pelagius was married to the beautiful heiress of an ancient dark elf noble family, Kintyra Rathim. Nordic kings who marry dark elves seldom improve their popularity. There are 2 reasons most scholars give for the union. Magnus was trying to cement relations with Ebonheart, where the Rathim clan hailed. Ebonheart's neighbors, Mournhold, had been a historical ally of the empire since the very beginning, and the royal consort of Queen Vernsei had won many battles in the War of the Red Diamond. Ebonheart had a poorly kept secret of aiding Uriel III and Potema. The other reason for the marriage was more personal. Kintyra was a shrewd diplomat as she was beautiful. If any creature was capable of hiding Pelagius' madness, it was she. On the 8th of Second Seed, the Third Era, 145, Magnus I died quietly in his sleep. Joleth, Pelagius' sister, took over the throne of Solitude, and Pelagius and Kintyra rode to the imperial city to be crowned, emperor and empress of Tamriel. It is said that Pelagius fainted when the crown was placed on his head, but Kintyra held him up so that only the closest to the throne could see what had happened. Like so many Pelagius' stories, this cannot be verified. Pelagius III never truly ruled Tamriel. Kintyra and the Elder Council made all the decisions, and only tried to keep Pelagius from embarrassing all. Still, stories of Pelagius III's reign exist. It is said that when the Argonian ambassador from Blackrose came to court, Pelagius insisted on speaking in all grunts and squeaks, as that is what Argonians' natural language. It is known that Pelagius was obsessed with cleanliness, and many guests reported waking to the noise of an early morning scrub down at the imperial palace. The legend of Pelagius, while inspecting the servants' work, suddenly defecating on the floor to give them something to do, is probably apocryphal. When Pelagius began actually biting and attacking visitors to the imperial palace, it was decided to send him to a private asylum. Katira was proclaimed regent for 2 years after Pelagius took the throne. For the next 6 years, the emperor stayed in a series of institutions and asylums. Traitors of the empire have many lies to spread about this period. Whispered stories of hideous experiments and tortures performed on Pelagius have almost become accepted as fact. The noble Lady Katira became pregnant shortly after the emperor was sent away, and rumors of infidelity and even more absurd conspiracies to keep the sane emperor locked away ran amok. As Katira proved, her pregnancy came about after a visit to her husband's cell. With no other evidence, as loyal subjects we are bound to accept the empress's word on the matter. Her second child, who had reigned for many years as Uriel IV, was the child of her union with her consort, Lariate, publicly acknowledged as such. On a warm night in Sunsdawn in his 34th year, Pelagius III died after a brief fever in his cell at the Temple of Kinnereth in the Isle of Bethany. Katira I reigned for another 46 years before passing the scepter on to the only child she had with Pelagius, Cassander. Pelagius' wild behavior has made him perversely dear to the province of his birth and death. The 2nd of Sunsdawn, which may or may not be the anniversary of his death, records are not very clear, is celebrated as Mad Pelagius, the time when foolishness of all sorts is encouraged, and so, one of the least desirable emperors in the history of the Septim dynasty has become one of the most famous ones. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the madness of Pelagius. Mara's Tear. Well, children, if you all gather round and sit quietly, I'll tell you the story of Mara's Tear and Shandar's sorrow. Long, long ago, long before your grandmother and I were born, long ago, there were 2 young children growing up in a village far, far from here. They played together and ran through the woods together, exploring their little world and learning to see things through each other's eyes. This was very different from their parents, because Shandar was the son of Maldor, who was captured in a war and forced to work as a slave to the village baron. Their village and another both needed the land between them to feed the villagers, and fought until many of the villagers died. Maldor was wounded in battle and left for dead by his fellows. He was captured and forced to work in the fields as punishment. Shandar was not allowed to play with Mara, but she was very small and the other children didn't like to play with her, so she played with Shandar against her father's command, and they learned that they were really not very different at all. They couldn't understand why their parents hated each other so. Well, Shandar and Mara played together for many years and learned to love each other as they grew up. They knew that they couldn't let their parents know because it was forbidden for them to ever marry, since they were from different villages and the war was still going on. They tried and tried to figure out how they could be happy together, and finally decided they must run away from their village. They would try to make a new life for themselves in another village far, far away from where they grew up. One night, while planning their escape, they were discovered by the town guards. Shandar tried to fight them, but they tied him up and dragged him away to the prison inside town. Mara was taken home, and her father was very angry with her, and told her that she could not leave their home again. He went to the house of another farmer and asked if their son would marry Mara, so that she could never see Shandar again. The marriage was planned for the next week. Shandar, meanwhile, was to be killed for daring to be with Mara. He was beaten and placed in a stockade. And they were to hang him the next day. When Mara found out that Shandar was to be killed, she knew that she could never live without him, and climbed out her window and ran into the woods, crying and crying. She ran and soon was lost. It was very dark, because back then they did not have any moons in the sky, to make it safe for the little boys and girls. Soon she found herself in a part of the wood where she had never been before, and sat down on a rock since she was very tired. Well, the rock was a secret entrance to a cave where a very mean orc lived. When he came back from his hunting, he found Mara curled up asleep on his rock, and thought to himself, a tasty little girl, I shall save her for my breakfast. He grabbed her and took her into his cave, moving the rock back so that she could not escape. She was sure to die and tried to escape, but the evil orc just laughed and laughed at her until she finally gave up. When the villagers found out that Mara had run off, they were very worried. No one knew the woods very well, and all were afraid of the evil orc that lived there. Only Shandar was not afraid, and he begged and begged the Baron to set him free, so that he could go look for Mara. The Baron finally decided to let Shandar go, for no one else was brave enough to go and rescue Mara. So Shandar was set free, and he set off into the woods to go and rescue her. Shandar searched and searched, but could not find poor Mara. Finally, he sat down on a rock to rest for a moment, and as he sat down, he noticed a piece of cloth under the rock. It was a piece of Mara's cloak. He realized that she must be under the rock somehow, and knew that the orc had captured her. He pushed and pushed on the rock and finally was able to roll it aside. He climbed down into the orc's cave, but it was very dark, and he could not see anything. The evil orc, when he had heard the front door moving, hid in the shadows to see what was coming into his home. When he saw that it was just a little man-boy, he grinned to himself and thought, "Now I have lunch too." When Shandar came near, the orc grabbed him and began to squeeze the life out of him. Back in the village, the people soon realized that they were foolish to let a young man go off into the woods by himself. They gathered all of their weapons and set off to find the two lost children. When they finally came upon the clearing near the orc's cave, they saw a strange and wondrous sight. A slain orc near the entrance to the cave, and Mara holding the head of poor Shandar in her lap. Shandar had killed the orc, but not before it gave Shandar a mortal wound. Mara's tears flowed freely from her eyes and splashed upon Shandar's face. Reflecting the light from the villagers' torches, Shandar was filled with sorrow at the thought that he had saved Mara only to lose her because of his own impending death from the battle with the orc. He cried out to Mara's namesake, the goddess of love, to help them. The goddess Mara recognized their true love and wept at their loss. Not having power over death, she could do nothing to save Shandar, but she knew that she could not let their love die. She reached down from the heavens and picked up Mara and Shandar in her arms and placed them high in the heavens. They could be together always and provide light in the dark night to others, so that they may be safe from the evils in the world. The villagers were amazed at this sight and vowed to honor the love of Shandar and Mara by learning more about themselves and their neighbors, so that the war that had been going on as long as anyone could remember would end. Shandar's sacrifice for the one he loved showed them that he was worthy of their respect, and that those from his village were just as proud and worthy as themselves. And that's why, children, every night we can see Mara's tear and Shandar's sorrow, spending their lives together high in the heavens, lighting the way for all little boys and girls like you. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Mara's tear. Mysticism. Unfathomable Voyage. Mysticism is the school of magic least understood by the magical community, most difficult to explain to novice mages. The spell's effects commonly ascribed to the school of mysticism were widely disparate of soul trap, the creation of a cell for a victim's spirit after death, to silence, the extinction of sound. But these effects are simply that, effects. The sorcery behind them is veiled in a mystery that may go back to the oldest civilization of Tamriel and beyond. The Psijics of the Order of Artaeum's term for mysticism is the Old Way. The phrase becomes bogged in a semantic quagmire because the Old Way also refers to the religion and customs of the Psijics, which may or may not be part of the magic of mysticism. There are a few mages who devote their lives to the study of mysticism. The other schools are far more predictable and fathomable. Mysticism seems to derive its power from its conundrums and paradoxes. The acts of experimentation, no matter how objectively implemented, can influence the magicka by its very existence. Thus, the mystic mage must regulate himself to finding consistent patterns in an imbroglio of energy, in the time it takes him to find a source with a consistent trigger and result. His peers researching in other schools may have researched and documented dozens of new spells and effects. The mystic mage is patient and uncompetitive scholar. For centuries, mostly during the Second Era, scholarly journals publishes theory after theory about the aspect or aspects of magicka that we call mysticism. In the tradition of the Mage's Guild to find answers to all things, respected researchers suggested the energy source as coming from Aetherius or the Daedra themselves to explain the seemingly random patterns of mysticism. Some ventured to guess that mysticism comes from the unused elements of successfully or unsuccessfully cast spells. Discussion with the Order of Artaeum after its reappearance has led some scholars to postulate that mysticism is more spiritual in nature. Either the intellect or emotion of the believer influences the energy patterns that flow. None of these explanations is truly satisfactory. For the beginning student of mysticism, it is best to simply learn the patterns distinguishable in the maelstrom in the centuries past. The more patterns are found, the clearer the remaining ones become, until of course, they change. The journey begins anew. And that was Mysticism, Unfathomable Journey. And that is the end of today's bonus episode. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.